Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Nun Hey. Today is the daf for the first day of Sukkot for Shabbat. We're going to start at we finished the Agadata in the previous shiur. We're going to start from the two dots Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, it's about 10 lines down from the top of the page. Tanu Rabbanan. Ketzah ma'abrin et ha'arim. How do we do the ibur, right? How do we make the boundaries on the city? We're now, after 2 days of Agadata, we're back to the beginning of the parak where we were talking about when things don't line up exactly. Aruka kimotchehi. Agula osin la zaviyot. If it's straight, okay, basically rectangular in shape, then we leave it exactly as it is. If it's agula, if it's rounded, osin la zaviyot. Okay, we make corners for it. For this, we're going to look at the pictures. So now we're going to see, right? If it's square, great. It's very obvious what we do. If it's rectangular. If it's rounded, we have to make corners. We have to basically make it out into a square. Mirubat enosin lazaviyot. If it's square already, then you don't need to make any angles. Hayta rechava mitzad echad u'ktsara mitzad acher ro'in oto ki'ilu hi shava. Okay, if it's longer, okay, this is we don't have a picture of this, I don't think. But there's picture, here's a picture. Okay, if it's kind of like the shape of a, right, where it's wider on one side and narrower on the other side, like a trapezoid, then we don't, right, in that case, we do extend the sides. Again, we make a square shape, okay, or rectangular, could be in this case. Haya bayit echad yotzei kimin pigum, או שני בתים יוצאים כמין שני פיגומים, רואים אותם כאילו חוט מתוח עליהן, ומודד ממנו על הלן 2,000 אמה. Okay, if you can see there's a picture in Rashi, there's a picture, there's something sticking out, right, where you have some sort of watchtower going outside, jutting out of the city. So if that's the case, and there were two pigumim, okay, we view it as if there's a string between the two, and you basically measure from there and outside 2,000 amma. Hayta suya kimin keshem, o kimin gam. Okay, back to pictures. I forgot to mention the picture number. Sorry, we're now at picture 194. Okay, so now what if it's a rainbow shape? Okay, here you see it makes a sort of, right, it's exactly a rainbow. Okay, so basically we have uninhabited area within that rainbow, and we have inhabited area within that rainbow. Okay, or the next picture, kimin gamma. Okay, gamma we mean by, it's actually like, it's kind of like the Hebrew letter chat sofit at the end. Okay, where here they do it a square shape, but it could be rectangular in shape also, where we end up again. There's part of it like this, like the letter chet would be, and you could see it in Rashi also. If you have a regular Gemara, kimin gamma. Okay, all the Gemaras have pictures on this. If you have some sort of commentary, and if you don't, you just have the regular Gemara, you end up with pictures in Rashi. So there's a min gamma there, okay, where you see it's there, they have it much less filled in than in this picture 195, but any kind of shape where part of it is filled in, excuse me, and part of it is not filled in. Okay, so again, what do? We square it out. Okay, we end up having the entire square shape there. So now, we view it as if the empty part is full of houses, full of courtyards. And then you only start counting 2,000 amma from there, even though it's theoretically, there's actually no space, there's no inhabited space in part of that area. Amarmar, aruka kimochi. So now they say, okay, if it's rectangular in shape, then it is, we leave it as it is. So the Gemara is now going to say, wait a minute, Pshita, isn't that obvious, right? Why are they telling us this? Okay, this was all a Braita that we quoted. So we're starting now to go back to this Braita and go line by line and try to explain. So isn't that obvious that we do it? Kimochi, what are you trying to tell us? So they say, Lo tzricha da'aricha ukatina. Okay, where it's both wide and it's both long and small. Okay, we'll explain what this is in a minute. Mao ditem aliten la putya aorka ka mashmalan. Okay, so you might have thought in this case, you might have thought that if it's aricha katina, we're saying it's basically what they're saying is first they think maybe they're talking about kind of a square shape. So then they say, no, what we're thinking is maybe it's a rectangle, or even if it was a rectangle, there's two different kinds of rectangles. You could have a rectangle that's very narrow on one end and very long on the other. So you might have thought, if that's the case, maybe we need to square it out. In other words, maybe if it's a rectangle shape, maybe you turn it into a square. And basically, as let's say it was not so wide, so you'd make the width equal to the length. You might have thought that. Kamash malan, that we don't. Mirubat enosim lazaviyot. So this is pshita. Obviously, you don't put corners. What kind of corners are you going to put on a square? It already has corners. Lo tzricha de mirba'a velo mirba'a beribua olam. Okay, what is this? So you might have said, what if it's a diamond shape? Okay, meaning it's square. A diamond is a square. Okay, but I'm trying to see, is there a picture here? Yeah, so let's look at the picture. Okay, you might have thought that here's the rectangle. I didn't look, 196. Here's where you have a rectangle. You might have thought to square it out. And now let's say you have a diamond. Now what they're trying to say is, what does it mean that it's a diamond? Because anyway you look at it, it could be a square if you turn it on its side. But the idea is that when it goes to the directions of the world, that's why it says Biribua Olam, it's not a perfect square where all the sides, one is on the east, one is on the west, one is in the north, one is in the south. No, it's diamond shaped so that it juts out at points in either direction. Now, if you're going to say that your Eruv goes 2,000 am in every direction, then maybe you would have thought, like we see in picture 197, that you make a square around the diamond to turn it into a square so that when you're looking at it as a diamond shape, it ends up being a square. And now we have four sides that are actually corresponding to the directions. So kamash malan, that we don't do that. Okay, it comes to teach us that we don't do that. Haya bayit echad yotzei kimin pigum, o shnei batim yotzim kimin shnei pigumim. So now they say, okay, right, either if it was one of these, we already said like a fortress or something, or one of these buildings, or two of them jutting out, or two houses jutting out like shnei pigumim. So hashtabayit echad amar shnei batim mevaya. Once you already say one house, so two houses, do you even need to ask? So they say, lo tzricha mishtei rucha. No, they wanted to tell you, what if there's one on one side and one on the other side? You might have thought we say in one direction, yes, but not necessarily would we say the same thing if there's jutting out in two different directions. So now they say, right, therefore, kamash malan. Therefore, it comes to teach us that, yes, in fact, we do. Just wanted to get you a picture of this. Okay, so if you look in the Schattenstein, what this means, b'shtei ruchot. So here you have the city. Okay, you have all these houses, and then you have one jutting out down there and one jutting out up there. So what they're basically saying is, we're going to have you gain an entire, right? We're going to square, we're going to even out the whole thing, both on both sides. Okay, you can even, you might have thought maybe we could only add it on one side. Maybe it's too much to start adding so much more. But in the end, they say, no, you can actually add it on both sides. Okay, so that was the section with the two houses. Now moving on to the next section. We're now in the third wide line. If it was like a rainbow shape, okay, so now you can imagine your city like a rainbow. Okay, you can also see the picture in Rashi, or we're going to look at the picture right now. I'll share screen. The next picture is 198. So now you have a keshet, okay, where in the rainbow part, you have people living. In the empty part underneath the rainbow, in the bow of the part underneath, you don't have anybody living. So if it's hasuya kimin keshet, o kimin gam, remember we also saw that, like the chet, the chaf sofit, I don't know why I said chet, the chaf sofit, right? So again, you view it as if it's closed, and then you measure from there 2,000 amot. Amar Rav Huna. Now, we're going to have a new halacha about this that we're going to explain now, which you're going to see in the picture. Ir ha'asuya kikeshet im ein ben shnei rashea pachot me'arba'at alafim ama modidim la min ha'yeter v'im lav modidim la min ha'keshet. Okay, the keshet, there's the keshet and the yeter. The yeter is this line that we're going to draw. Okay, we can draw a line between the two sides of the rainbow and close it off and say we're going to measure from there, but that's only if there's less than 4,000 cubits of distance between both sides of the rainbow. But if not, then you have to measure from the rainbow part, meaning from the part where there's inhabitants. So now they question him. Rav Huna Hachi, did he really say this? V'hamar Rav Huna. Okay, next picture. Chomat ha'ir shenifritza b'mea va'arba'im ve'achat u'shlish. If you have a city, the whole city was together, but then all of a sudden there was a war or something happened, some natural disaster, we don't know what, but the walls were knocked down. And you can see from this picture, 199, not only were the walls knocked down, but all the houses that were in the middle of the two parts of the city are now wiped out entirely. Now, at what space would we consider these two separate cities? They're going to be two separate cities, 141 and a third. You might say this is a random number. In a minute, we're going to see that it's our number 70 and 2/3 that we keep coming back to doubled. Okay, so it's not such a random number. So now we're going to view this city as if it's two separate cities if there's a breach of 141 and a third amot. Now, if that's the measurement, then why, when we have a keshet, okay, go back up to our rainbow picture, and there's 4,000 am of distance, why don't we use the same 141 and a third? 4,000 is way more, and we still view this as one city, one unit, and we're going to measure the tchum from that imaginary line. We're going to draw from one side to the other. So why would that be? So Amar Rabba Bar Ula lo kasha, kan beruach achad, kan mishtei ruchot. Okay, so now we're going to say, this is different because here, right, this is only on one side, it's open here. Whereas in the city, right, on the rainbow, there's one side which is actually solid, right? Where you go along the rainbow, there's people living straight there. That's why only if the rainbow part is open in that one side, then it's going to have to be 4,000 amot. But when you have the city breached all the way through and there's nothing there, it's empty space in between both, then we're not going to count that as, we're going to basically already count it as two separate cities with only a distance of 141 and a third. So now the Gemara says, wait, my kamashmalan, what's Rav Huna trying to teach us by telling us this? This thing about the chomat ha'yer shenifritza. Dinotnim karpaf lezo. He's trying to tell us, remember, karpaf is that distance of 70 and 2/3. We're basically going to say, it's like we're using karpaf a little bit differently than we used it last time. But we basically say that we're going to give each city, remember we already talked about that when you talk about the borders of a city, you have 2,000 amma outside the city, but we include the outskirts of the city, 70 and 2/3 amma. And also if we have some sort of structure that's within 70 and 2/3, then we already keep pushing the boundaries out. So basically we're going to say here, are you trying to say that each city gets a karpaf of space? We're basically viewing it as if this city is now two cities, as long as each city has their own 70 and 2/3 around it, then it already becomes two cities. If we're going to say that, then Ha'amar Rav Huna Chadazina. He already told us this. How do we know this? Ditnan. Notnim karpaf le'ir divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, you get a karpaf for a city. Okay, each city gets a karpaf around it. Okay, this is, if we see, right, here's the next picture, picture 200. You basically, every city gets 70 and 2/3 amma from outside it, and then we start counting the 2,000 amma. That's in picture number 200. V'chachamim omrim, lo amru karpaf ela ben shtei ayarot. No, karpaf is not for the city. It's to teach you that you don't get a karpaf, you only get a karpaf in between two cities. Okay, so that means, what it really means, Rashi says here, and you see it on the picture, in picture 201, it says, Lechabran al yedei karpaf benehem. That means if there's less than a karpaf in between two cities, we're going to view it as one city. Ve'itmar, and then Rav Huna came and said, karpaf lezo ve'karpaf lezo. When we talk about a karpaf between the two cities, we mean a karpaf for each city. So isn't that exactly what he said? Look at picture number 201. It's two cities with a karpaf in between. And it's very similar to picture number 199, which is this big breach in the city with two karpafim in between, right? Two spaces of 70 and 2/3. So it's basically the same thing. So why do Rav Huna need to say it in both? And then they're just continuing and telling you, the Chia bar Rav Amar, Ein nonim ela karpaf echad l'shnehem. Rav says, no. It's one karpaf for both cities, okay? But our focus is really Rav Huna. Why did Rav Huna say both there that it's two karpafim in between two cities, and also in our case? So now they say, well, the two cases are different. One was a city to begin with, and it got split in half. And The other case was two separate cities to begin with. So there's obviously a difference. So tzricha, you need them both. If you had the case of the two of there with the one city, mishum dehave leitzad heter meikara, they were already considered two separate cities. Aval hatam, 1 second, I just want to check. When it was already when it was one city, we already viewed this as one entity, and therefore it had a tzad heter meikara. We already viewed it as one city, so you might think until you have two karpafim, right, that much distance, we're still going to consider this one. Aval hatam emalo, but between two cities, maybe one karpaf of distance is enough. The iyashmin on hatam, but let's say you only had it with the two cities, that were already two separate cities, and you wanted to say there you need two karpafs. Well, why would you need two karpafs there and maybe not when the city walls get breached and the houses get knocked down? Maybe one would be enough, because mishum de dechika tashmishayu. In that case with the two separate cities, why do we get 70 2/3? Because the assumption is that 70 2/3 cubits outside the city is still used for the purposes of the city. So if I start off with two cities, each city uses that space for their own, and that's why they're only going to be considered two separate cities if there's two karpafim in between them. But if we have this one city that used to be one city, now there's a big breach in the wall, those people are not going to use that space in between because they never needed it before. So therefore, you might say, they don't need 141 1/3 cubits of space because they're not using this space, okay? Because they never used it before. It used to be full of houses. So therefore, emalo, maybe just 70 2/3 would be enough to already say this city is split into two. And therefore, it's tzricha. That's why you needed both. V'kama bein yeter l'keshet. Going back to our rainbow picture, okay? Let's go back to the picture. We're now in picture number 202. So now we have this rainbow. Now the question is, we're drawing this imaginary line at the bottom of the rainbow. Now, how much space is there from where it's inhabited until the bottom of the rainbow that we're still going to say this works? So Rabbi Bar Huna Amar Alpayim Amah. He says if it's 2,000 amot or less, if it's more, like you see in this picture of 202, where it's more than 2,000 amma of uninhabited space, then already you're not going to be able to say that we measure it from the bottom line, because the people at the tip here are so far away from that dotted line. They're more than 2,000 cubits away. We're not going to allow this to happen. So you can't measure the 2,000 amma from that imaginary line. But Rava Berei de Rava Bar Huna, okay, Rava, the son of Rava Bar Huna, said, Afilu yeter me'alpayim amma. Even if it's more than 2,000 amma, it's still fine. Rabbi, Kavate de Rava Berei de Rava Bar Huna, Mistabra, seems like we hold like the second opinion. Why? Dibai hadar ate derech batim. Because the people living at this tip here, which is the farthest point from or at least the farthest, right, where there's uninhabited space, and there's more than 2,000 amma to get to that dotted line, well, they don't necessarily have to walk 2,000 amma to get there. They can walk through the city all the way to the bottom of the rainbow. And therefore, basically, it doesn't really make any sense to say that they're more than 2,000 amma away, because there's ways that they can walk through the houses and get to the edge of the city there. So therefore, even though they're living maybe in the tip there and there's more than 2,000 cubits, still we say it's okay. Okay, going back to the Mishnah. Hayusham gdudiyot gvohot asarat tvachim. Okay, if you remember, we had these gdudiyot. These were uninhabited houses that were 70 2/3 cubits outside the city. So now they say, my gdudiyot, what are these, right? We said if they're 10 tvachim tall. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, shalosh mechitzot she'en alehem tikra. Okay, sounds very similar to Sukkah. Okay, it's on the first day of Sukkot. So 3 walls, you only need 3 walls minimum for a Sukkah. So here also, we're going to say 3 walls, even if it doesn't have a ceiling. Okay, that's still considered enough of a structure that it's being used by the city, and therefore we can count the line from there. Ibailahu, now they ask the following question. What about classic Gemara? Shtei mechitzot v'yesh alehem tikra. If 3 walls without a ceiling, what if there's 2 walls with a ceiling? Maybe that's the same as 3 walls without. Mahu. Tashma. They say, let's learn from here. Elu shemitadbrim ima. Nefesh sheyesh ba'arba amot al arba amot. Okay, so these are parts that get included in the city. Remember, the nefesh was that place that they built on top of the grave, where the watchman over the graves would sit there or would live there. So nefesh sheyesh ba 400 al 400, if it's 4 by 4 amot, why? That's already significant. V'hagesher, and a bridge. V'hakever sheyesh ba beit tira, if you have a grave with a place where somebody lives, which is similar to the nefesh. Not 100% clear what the differences are. Ubeit hakneset sheyesh ba beit tira lechazan, if a shul has a house or a space for living quarters for the chazan, or beit avodat kochavim sheyesh ba beit tira lekomarim, or you have a house of idol worship where they have a house for their priests, v'ha'orvot v'ha'otzarot, the stables or the treasure, the places where they housed all their food, shebesadot, that are in the fields, v'yesh bahem beit tira, and again, if they have a place where people live, v'haborganim shebetocha, okay, and the borganim, those are these little huts that are within 70 2/3 amma outside the city. V'habayit shabayam, and a house on the sea. We'll get to what this is. Hare elu mitabrin ima, right? It's kind of like a lighthouse, although we'll see that they didn't really use it like a lighthouse. These are all mitabrin ima. Ve'elu she'em mitabrin ima, but which are not considered. Nefesh shenifretza mishtei ruchoteha elach ve'elach. If you have a nefesh, this house that they put on top of the cemetery, on top of the grave, that was breached in two sides. Okay, so here you see breach in two sides is a problem. Although it doesn't say anything about a roof, so hold off from a ceiling, so hold off for a minute. The hagesher, these are all the opposite of all the cases we saw before. Hagesher v'hakever she'en lehem beit tira, if you have a bridge or a grave that doesn't have a place for living. Ubeit knesset she'en la beit tira lechazan, or a shul that doesn't have any living quarters in it. Ubeit avodat kochavim she'en la beit tira lekomarim, or an idol worship place that doesn't have any living quarters. V'orvot v'otzarot shebesadot she'en lehem beit tira, and likewise for the stables and the storage houses. Ubor v'shiach u'ma'ara, ditches that are round or square or rectangular. V'gader v'shovach, or a fence, or the dovecotes shebitocha, that are on the fields. V'habayit shebasfina, and a house that's on a boat. Okay, what's the reason for a house on a boat? Well, let's say you have a houseboat that's sitting 70 2/3 within 70 2/3 from your city. But the problem is that it moves all the time. So it doesn't help you. We're not going to measure from there because boats tend to be moved and move all the time. They're not stable. Ein elu mitablim ima. So these are not considered part of the city. So now why do we bring this? Don't we assume we mean the two walls broke, but we still have the ceiling? Lo, delay katika. No, you don't necessarily have to say that. It could be it's a case where there was no ceiling, in which case we don't learn anything about this for our question. So we end up without a question. In the meantime, we brought this braita, so now we're going to go into details about this braita. What do we use a house on the water for? What's this house structure near the water? Amar Papa bayit shasur lefanot bo kelim shebesfina. It was a house that they would use that when they brought in things from boats, they would put the items in there, and there was obviously somebody watching them. Umara emet aberet ima. So now we're going to talk about this, the cave. A cave is not mitaberet ima. V'hatani Rabbi Chia, but didn't Rabbi Chia say, ma'ara mitaberet ima? He said a cave is part of the city. So Amar Bai, kasheyesh binyan al pia. It depends whether there's some sort of living structure there or not on top of the cave. V'tepugle mishum begin, v'tepugle mishum binyan. So then they say, well, then why don't we say it's a binyan? So they say, gufe lo tzricha lahashlim. 1 second. I'm not sure what this means. 1 minute. We're saying here, 1 second. Bayit should be yam. Okay, so now we say, right, the mara. So now they say, why don't we say, if it has a binyan, then basically it's because it has a binyan. It shouldn't be for the cave's sake. So then they say, no, what they mean is lahashlim. What does it mean, lahashlim here? It means that if you had a structure in the cave or on top of the cave that was only, let's say, 2 by 2, and it wasn't 4 by 4, we'd use the space in the cave to make it as if it was 4 by 4. Okay, so we basically end up saying it's the cave together with the structure. So even if the structure is really small, and you can't really use it for living space, but since it has some sort of structure, we combine it with the cave, and then it ends up being significant that we're going to say, because of that, it's considered a structure in there. It has a beit tira, in which case, right, the whole idea is then it's considered as part of the city for our purposes of the tchum. Okay, next. Amarav Papa. No, I did that. Okay, Amarav Huna. Yoshveit Srifim. Okay, these are little huts. Okay, these very flimsy huts that people lived in. If we have a city full of huts, we're going to count from the hut itself and not from the boundary of the city, because this is a very temporary place of living. People don't really dwell there permanently. That's not a city. It's interesting because we're getting into definitions. What makes something a city, right? All of these questions are what makes something part of the city that we're going to measure from there, and all goes down to living quarters. And here we're going to see, even if it's living quarters, it's only if it's significant living quarters, but not if it's very temporary. Interesting. We're talking on Sukkot about temporary abodes, right? It's very interesting to think about. So now, Mativ Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, wait a minute. How could you say that? This is the Jews dwelled in the desert in these tents, right? Exactly what Sukkot, right, is a memory of the tents in the time of the desert, right? Either the tents or the Ananei Kavod, right? The clouds that protected us. But here you have the tent, right? These very flimsy kind of dwellings, and yet we call it, they dwelled there, okay? Okay, the space where they lived was 3 parsot on 3 parsot. How much is a parsa? A parsa is 8,000 amot. So we're talking 24,000 amot. That was really big. Vitanya, and yet it says in a Braita, Keshehen nifnim, ein nifnim, lo lifnehem velo litzidehen, ela lacharehem. When people went to the bathroom, they wouldn't go in front of them or to the sides of them when they were in the desert. They would always go behind the camp. Okay, what's the concern? Because of the Ananei Kavod that I just mentioned, they didn't want to be going to the bathroom where the Ananei Kavod was. The assumption is the Ananei Kavod were always moving forward, so they would always go behind the camp. Now here you see that they let them walk all the way out, right? That was a long distance. They must have viewed this as all one camp, okay? That's why they could walk that far. So Amalei Rava, Diglei Midbar Kamarta, what you're asking from the desert? Kevan Dachtibu, Al Pi Hashem Yachanu, Al Pi Hashem Yasu, Kiman Dekfi Alei Dami. It's true they dwell there temporarily, but when did they move? When God told them to move. It's not like they could just get up one morning and say, oh, we're moving. No, and they took down their tents. No, God told them, and therefore it becomes permanent, okay? Because it was basically all based on the word of God. Therefore, their dwelling was considered permanent, and that's why it was viewed as a city. But generally, people who live in Srifim are considered, in these little huts, are considered not, as it's not considered a city. Again, all you get is, you basically you measure from your hut and not from the border of the city. Amarav Chinan, Amarav Kahana, Amarav Ashi. Here, however, he limits this. If the city is mostly Srifim, these huts, but there's 3 courtyards with 2 houses in each, then already we're going to consider this significant. Okay, this is a city. That's a minimum amount for a city. We actually used this amount just a few days ago. In another context about whether you need 50 people or whether you need, right, if there was a small city that became, if it was a large city that got smaller, or I forget which direction, or small that got larger, right, if it was large that got smaller, how many people you needed, there was something about the 3 chatzerot and 2 houses. Amarav Yehuda Amarav. Now we're going to get a little bit off track and talk about people who live in huts, and they're a little bit derogatory about them. Yoshveit Srifim, or maybe I should say a lot, it's a pretty harsh statement. Yoshveit Srifim v'holchemet barot, people who live in these huts and basically move all the time, and people who wander in the desert, basically they're talking about nomads, people who have nomadic type of life. Chayehem einam chayim, their life is no life. This is pretty rotten, okay? It's not nice to live like that. But worse than that, nishehem u'bnehem einan shalahem. Their wives and their children, they think are theirs, they're not really, okay? We're going to see why in a minute. What does it mean they're not theirs? It means their wives are sleeping around with other people, and their children are mamzerim, okay? Because they're not their own children; they're from other people. Why is that? So Tanya Namihach, here's a Braita to support. Eliezer ish Biria Omer, Yoshvei Srifim ki Yoshvei Kvarim. The people who live in Srifim are like people living in the grave. Okay, this is the same thing. They have no life. It's pretty miserable. This is pretty harsh to say they're like they're dead. And Arur is the person who sleeps with their daughters. It's like sleeping with an animal because their daughters are mamzerim, because they were born from illicit marriages. My time, what's the reason? So why do they have such a bad rap? So we're going to have 2 different reasons. Ulamar, she'ein lahem merchatzaot. They don't have bathhouses. So what does that mean? When the men go to bathe, they have to go far away to bathe. They leave their wives for a long period of time, and their wives end up sleeping with other people. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Mipnei shemargishim ze lezeh b'tfilah. Okay, here a little bit, the women are a little bit less to blame in this version. It's because the women go to the mikvah, but because the mikvahot are not near where they're living either, they have to go far. So they start telling their neighbors and they want to go with somebody. So two women might go together, or they'll tell their friends, I'm going to the mikvah, come with me. And then two women will go together. And because it's just two women on their own, they often get raped on the way or attacked, by some man who wants to sleep with them. I don't know if it's exactly rape, but probably kind of rape. And they end up with, again, their wives end up with other men and their children are mamzerim. My benayu, what's the difference between these two? If there's a nahar near their house, so the women can do the mikveh in the nahar, in the river, but the men don't generally wash, they don't use it as a merchatz. They still want to go to their bathhouses, and then they go to their bathhouses, and then they come back, and their wives already have been with other men. Okay, we're going to stop here for today and pick up from Amar Rav Huna on Sunday. Chag Sameach to everybody, Shabbat Shalom, and we will pick up, as I said, on Sunday morning.